Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you're joining us around the world. On behalf of the South Center and Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, I welcome you to this webinar. This webinar will be discussing important issues with regards to innovation and access to medical technologies that are essential in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we will be discussing today the issue between the intersect of intellectual property rights and the issues with regards to ensuring innovation and access to these essential technologies for everyone around the world. So some of the issues we will be discussing, of course, is the experiences so far that we've seen within innovation and access, as well as informed by previous experiences in other disease areas. In particular, we'll be looking at the mechanism of voluntary licensing, how these have been operating in general terms, as well as what are the other related mechanisms that can promote access from the legal perspective through the intellectual property system. So for our webinar today, we have 5 excellent panelists who are really experts in that intersect between intellectual property law and public health, which is not always easy connection. And for those of you who are new to this topic, we hope that this will be very informative. For others that are experts, we hope also that this will also enlighten your own knowledge and perspective of the issues. So I will first start just presenting our panel. We have with us Lina Mengani, who is the IP advisor for the Access campaign of Médecins Sans Frontières. We also have Dr. Burcu Kilik, who is the research director of Public Citizen, which is a leading pro-consumer organization, a nonprofit from the United States that works in the public interest. We have Dr. Carlos Correa, who is the executive director of the South Center. We have Yuan Hu, who is the policy coordinator and senior legal advisor with the Access campaign of Médecins Sans Frontières. And we have Mustaqim Degama, who is a counselor with the South African mission to the World Trade Organization and the United Nations. So thanks to all our panelists for joining us. I will be moderating the session. My name is Viviana Munoz, and I coordinate the program on health, intellectual property, and biodiversity at the South Center. So to start our meeting today, just a few ground rules. You have access to the Q&A section below in the webinar. So if you'd like to pose any questions, you can do those here. Then we will be opening those for panelists after the presentations have been made. You will also find that there is a chat enabled in case you want to pose a particular question there to a panelist or to myself, or generally to attendees to share. And we'll also be putting their information, for example, link to some relevant materials from the different institutions that are here that might be useful on the issues we'll be discussing. So I will start now our panel by passing the floor to Lina Mengani, who will start bringing us through some of the first issues. But prior to Lina, I'd first like to pass on the floor to Professor Carlos Correa of the South Center to bring us for the introduction. So Professor Correa, to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Viviana. It's really a pleasure for the South Center to organize this meeting with MSF, such an important organization working for the public health, so active in all areas, now in particular with COVID-19. I would like to make a characterization of voluntary licensing and then make a brief comparison with voluntary license and conclude by saying why the waiver that has been submitted by India, South Africa, and supported by so many countries is important. So voluntary license can be of a bilateral nature. This happens when a company, pharmaceutical company, owning eventually patent, decides to grant a license to a competitor, another pharmaceutical company, in a developed or in a developing country. So if there is a patent, the decision to grant or not the license rests with the licensor, with the patent owner. As we all know, patents confer legal monopolies, although there might be mechanisms such as compulsory licensing in order to break or mitigate those monopolies. In principle, the decision whether to license or not is just a business decision. It's up to the owner of the patent to decide whether they want or not a particular drug to be commercialized by a third party. This happens. So licensing is not uncommon in the pharmaceutical sector, but it is subject to the decision of the patent owner. In the context of competition law, there is one doctrine, which is called refusal to deal, which in some jurisdictions, not in all jurisdictions, will allow a seeker of a commercial license to get a compulsory license if there is a refusal by the owner of the patent. But this is not a generally accepted doctrine. In some countries it works, in other countries it does not work. In any case, for many companies, both in developed and developing countries, just to seek a compulsory license is not what they aim at, but to have a good relationship with the patent owner, in order, because they are also companies that they're deciding to do a good business, and therefore there is a business relationship that is prevalent in their consideration. But then when a license like this, a voluntary license like this is negotiated, there is a basic asymmetry, because the patent owner has a very strong position because he's got a monopoly. And then generally the patent owner may choose different companies. So the negotiation is done in a context of asymmetry, which leads to a number of consequences. One of these consequences is generally voluntary licenses are limited in time. And in general, the licensee, the receiver of the license, is obliged to commercialize the pharmaceutical product under the trademark of the licensor. So this means that if the license terminates, it will terminate in generally 5 years, then after that, the licensee has no further right at all to continue the commercialization of the product. So in many cases, what has happened is that through a licensing agreement, in fact, the licensor opens the market through a licensee, and then thereafter, the licensor gets full control of the market. So it is the decision in some cases in order to spend less. There is no need to spend in the launching of the product. This is done by the licensee. But then after some years, the market is actually under control of the licensor. License agreements, of course, entail payment of royalties. Royalties in the pharmaceutical sector are quite high. There is an interesting study by MedTrack, which comprises some statistics about the usual royalty payments in pharmaceutical licensing agreements. So this report clearly indicates that these royalties may range from 1.5% to 25% or more. And of course, if you have a product which is commercially important, as it might be, for instance, now a vaccine for COVID-19 or a treatment for COVID-19, very likely the royalty will be very high. And this, of course, has an impact on the price. So this means that the licensees in general are not able to put the products under license in the market at a low price because royalties are high. In addition to this, in most licensing agreements pharmaceutical, there is another important factor. And this is that the licensor reserves the right to provide the active ingredient for the production of the licensed medicine. And in general, the price for the active ingredient is fixed unilaterally by the licensor. And this is the main, I would say, this is the main source of income for the licensor. The royalty may be more or less important. It may not matter too much because the licensor has the possibility to charge a price on the inputs, on the active ingredients. For instance, in many cases, the active ingredient will be just formulated by the licensee. And this is a major source of income for the licensor. In addition, this has an impact on the price because if the price is set for the input set by the licensor, then the licensee has a limit margin in order to charge a low price. In addition to this, it's very common for licensing agreements to contain price fixing provisions, under which the licensor actually determines the price at which the product can be sold. And this is part of a long-term strategy. They don't want the market to be familiar with a low price because they may wish to enter the market, as I mentioned before, later on. And therefore, it is not uncommon to have this price fixing provision. Moreover, licensing agreements have territorial restrictions. In most cases, the licensee is allowed to sell in one country or a few countries, is not allowed to export. And therefore, a license agreement, voluntary license agreement, does not generate competition at the global market. It may bring a product into a particular territory, but it does not push prices down, and this is a major interest for consumers, for patients, and is one of the things MSF is working so hard to achieve. Then this is why voluntary licensing, following the usual patterns, will not provide the solution to COVID-19. It does not provide solution also in other diseases, because it's very much subject to this asymmetric negotiation, to conditions imposed by the licensor, by subjecting the licensee to a number of parameters and standards, including on pricing, that limit significantly the impact that a license agreement may have in allowing affordable access to medicines under this mechanism. So the second point I wanted to raise is a system which is not the bilateral based system as I have just described, but is the medicines patent pool. As you, those who are working in this area, they know very well, the medicines patent pool was established, by the way, 10 years ago. It has an objective to negotiate with pharma companies licensing agreements in order to sub-license these agreements to generic producers in developing countries. So after 10 years, the medicines patent pool has been able to negotiate with 10 patent holders in relation to 15 HIV/AIDS drugs, 2 hepatitis C antivirals, 1 TB drug, and 1 HIV technology platform. 22 generic manufacturers now have sub-license under the MPP in accordance to some information provided by MPP. Since the operation started 10 years ago, the system has allowed to save about $270 million US. That would mean 27 million US per year. And in accordance to a study they have produced, more than 12 million people have had access to antiretroviral therapy since 2010. So the medicines patent pool has made a significant impact in some areas, but of course is limited to the extent that it depends again on the voluntary decision of the companies to provide a license to the pool. In some cases, I know the medicine patent pool have a lot of efforts to negotiate with some companies. We have just refused to do that. In some cases, it has been successful, but in most cases, I must underline this, despite the efforts made by the Secretariat of the MPP, of the Medicine Patent Pool, I really know that they have worked very hard on this. But in most cases, these licenses are not global. There are territorial limitations. What generally happens is that the patent owner reserves for itself the most profitable markets, and therefore in many countries, including, for instance, in my own country, in Latin America, and many others, do not get the access to products which are produced under this sub-license. So this is one limitation of also of this voluntary model, in which conditions can still be provided or established by the patent owner. There is some room for negotiation, but in any case, as I mentioned before, the patents are quite strong rights, and therefore the MPP has not been able to get universal access at affordable price as it was its objective. Then let me mention some mechanisms that have been put in place in the context of the United Nations agencies in order to facilitate access to technology. The first one is the Technology Facilitation Mechanism, which was developed. There was a lot of diplomatic activity in order to get in paragraph 70 of Agenda 2030, the recognition of the establishment of the Technology Facilitation Mechanism, which has created recently, this mechanism launched in July 20, an online platform, 2030 Connect. The purpose of this facilitation mechanism is to share information, experiences, best practices, and provide policy advice. So it does not work really as a mechanism that will allow manufacturing companies, for instance, in developing countries, to get technologies to produce COVID-19 related vaccines or treatments. So this will not provide the kind of solution that we may need if there is, as it is, the need to provide vaccines to the global population. billions of doses, or in the case that the treatment is actually developed, to be able to produce and commercialize this treatment at affordable prices. A second mechanism I like to mention, but again, it does not solve problems on the basis of voluntary approach. This is the so-called Waiver match mechanism, which facilitates interaction between suppliers and seekers of technology. To me, it's unknown what kind of impact this WIPO match has had, but clearly there is no reference or indication that it has played any role in the context of COVID-19, or in particular in the area of pharmaceuticals. The third mechanism is, I would like to mention, is the Technology Bank for Least Developed Countries. This was established in 2018 in order to facilitate access to technologies to the least developed countries. This is a particular objective. As we all know, in fact, under the TRIPS agreement, there is an obligation on developed countries to set up incentives in order for the entities and their territories to provide technology to least developed countries. This mechanism has failed, as we all know. Interestingly, in a recent paper by the WTO Secretariat, it is suggested that Article 66, paragraph 2, does not provide for an obligation on developed countries, which is not really the right obligation. In any case, there is no evidence showing that these incentives mechanism has actually generated a flow of technology to least developed countries as they actually need in order to enhance their technological capacity. And then the fourth, and perhaps more relevant for our discussion now, the fourth mechanism is the Technology Access Partnership, TAP, that was created upon an initiative of, we all know, the president of Costa Rica, with the idea of generating a pool of technologies, including patents, know-how, so on and so forth, in relation to COVID-19. And the very purpose of this initiative was to encourage companies that own or have rights on technologies related to COVID-19 to donate these technologies, to put these technologies in its pool, whether they are trade secrets or other rights, in order to facilitate access by manufacturers all over the world, and they'll be able to supply the world population with vaccines, treatments, diagnostic kits, or even equipment which is necessary to treat different patients. But although this initiative has received the support of a significant number of governments, and also has been launched in cooperation with UNDP, UNCTAD, the World Organization, and also the bank I mentioned for least developed countries, so far as we know, there has been no enthusiasm at all on the side of the pharmaceutical companies to provide technologies under this mechanism. So they have been actually very reluctant. There has been no participation of the association that works for the so-called big pharma. Therefore, this mechanism does not seem to offer, again, the solution that though the proponents, initially the proponents, including the person of Costa Rica, were looking for. So just to conclude, we are looking for a solution to provide vaccines at affordable prices, to provide treatments, equipment, diagnostic kit to a population of 9.7 billion people. Just for vaccines, you need to, if 2 doses are necessary, you need to count this twice. And therefore, it is essential to get access to technologies. This means to be able to use patented knowledge. In the area of vaccines, for instance, some technology specific, in some cases, some methods to develop vaccines are patented. There is a need to access to know-how. In the production of vaccines, for instance, know-how is important, production of equipment is important. And therefore, countries, those in particular in the context of WTO, need to get a very fast mechanism in order to get access to this technology. Of course, we have the 3 flexibilities there. We have the possibility of granting compulsory license or government use. And these are very important flexibilities, and we need to confirm the importance of these flexibilities. However, in a context of an emergency like this, in the context of 3 minutes, okay, in the context of a pandemic like this, compulsory license take time. They are not, now the European Commission, interestingly, is talking about fast-track compulsory license, but they take time. They are subject to certain conditions. They apply only to patents. They do not apply, for instance, generally to designs. If there is a design which is necessary to produce an equipment, the compulsory license is not developed in the respect. It's not developed for trade secrets, although there might be something like compulsory license for trade secrets. It is in many cases, it is subject to appeal by the owners of the technology. Some laws provide for the possibility to appeal, and this will frustrate the very purpose of the compulsory license. And in addition to this, countries that have tried to use the compulsory license system in the past have been subject to political pressure, as we know. For instance, the case of Thailand, both the United States and the European Commission put a lot of pressure on the government of Thailand when they decided to grant 6 or 7 compulsory licenses. The most recent example is in Latin America, perhaps with the case of Colombia and in Martinique, where Colombia was challenged by the US government very seriously if they granted compulsory license. So compulsory license can be used. In some cases, the norms under which compulsory license can be used should be improved in many developing countries in order to ensure a full use of this flexibility. But also political pressures play a role. Now the European Commission is saying that they fully respect compulsory licensing. As I mentioned, they talk about fast tracking them, but the European Commission has a very important record of opposing to compulsory license in developing countries, arguing that the situations or the emergency is not there, and then ignoring that compulsory license can be granted not only in cases of emergency, as it is the case right now, but in other situations as well. Then a waiver has been proposed will address all these problems altogether, will address the limitations of voluntary license, and will address the limitations and pressures that may be exerted in cases that compulsory license system or government use is one of the options. And therefore, this is an important tool that needs to be supported. Let me just add that there is also an argument about using Article 31 bis, which was, as we know, incorporated more recently in the TRIPS agreement. But the system is so cumbersome. It will be very difficult to use this system, in particular in the context of COVID-19. In fact, since the waiver was adopted many years ago already, it has been only one case under 31B. So we need a different solution. Just to conclude, voluntary licensing as such is not the right tool in order to address the emergency and the COVID-19. Secondly, compulsory license and government use is an important tool. We need to reinforce them, but there may be, as perhaps COVID-19, a need to review national laws to ensure that these laws are actually allowing the governments to use fully the flexibilities that are in the TRIPS agreement. And finally, maybe this could also be an opportunity to think about reviewing Article 31 bis that will not work in situations like this or other situations in order to ensure that affordable medicines reach the people all over the world. Thank you, Viviana. So I'm very much interested in looking at how the discussion goes, and thank you very much for our colleagues to accept to speak in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Correa. I pass the floor now to Lina Mengeli, who's Global IP Advisor with the Access Campaign in MSF. Lina, you have the floor.
So thank you very much for having me here for this webinar. And what I'm going to really focus on is our experiences of licensing in the past decade. And one of the reasons why I would like to highlight is that we don't stop when the licenses are signed. Our work actually in MSF starts when the licenses are signed. And what we have seen as people who procure medicines and our experiences in different countries and how these licenses play out, we've documented in our briefing document that we published in October, and we are going to be sharing some of the recommendations and also experiences in this presentation. So I just wanted to highlight one of the gravest problems that we have is the lack of transparency. And it's been a very tough battle to even access the terms and conditions of voluntary licenses, particularly bilateral ones. The only exception is, of course, the Medicines Patent Pool, which has been fully publishing its agreements in the public domain. However, more recently, it has chosen to keep key terms and conditions, particularly royalty, outside of the public domain, and has refrained from publishing those terms and conditions in its recent agreement with Waiver. When it comes to transparencies, we've seen that governments who actually do have a mechanism for registering the voluntary licenses actually do very little with what they have. So you do have a mechanism of registering voluntary licenses in different jurisdictions, including, for example, India, but getting access to those registered voluntary licenses is a process that will take you to court and a tough battle. One of the things I would like to highlight is civil society's role in using the freedom to information laws or the right to information laws in different jurisdictions, including Brazil. And more recently, civil society in India has filed for a copy of the agreements being signed between companies and government and companies and companies. So transparency is very, very critical. And it raises issues not only in terms of intellectual property and understanding where you can take the medicine or not, which is our problem as MSF. Often, even in bilateral licenses, it's tough to get a full list of countries where you can actually take the generic too. What we also see is this in the issue of transparency is that recently, for example, companies like AstraZeneca who are entering into deals with Indian companies, there are conditions relating to liability. So therefore, transparency is not just about looking at the terms and conditions about what the territorial coverage is, but also other terms and conditions that have a direct impact on public health and, of course, public interest, which is the liability clauses. So I just wanted to highlight that there are several licenses in the bilateral space, which we have only been able to document by speaking to stakeholders like the generic companies and the licensors. And this document that we publish has highlighted some of those experiences. The second thing I would like to highlight, which Professor Korea actually highlighted, is the refusal to deal or refusal to license. And many countries have been faced with that, not only under the Medicines Patent Pool, but in bilateral licenses, and in some cases, an outright refusal to license even for a single country. So what we really see in voluntary licenses that the impact is very limited because they systematically leave out Eastern Europe, Central Asia, middle income countries, sometimes all of upper middle income countries. And they actually propagate a system of keeping the most lucrative markets to themselves, which may be an economic or a business tool for them. But however, for patients who are in those countries, it's a real access issue barrier. I would also like to highlight the middle income countries, for example, particularly upper middle income countries. One of the areas that they really face a big problem with is that they have been excluded from a lot of funding mechanism as they're seen as richer countries within the developing world. And as a result, funding from Gavi, funding from the Global Fund has been transitioned out. At the same time, they face steep patent barriers that hike up the prices and don't allow them to access the drugs as generics. Yes, of course, one of the most important things that one of the countries did was Malaysia, who decided to address the exclusion of their territory from a voluntary license. And wanted to address this from a public health point of view because they wanted to treat hepatitis C. They wanted to undertake clinical trials for hepatitis C treatments, and they needed the drug sofosbuvir. So they issued a compulsory license. And I think this is a particularly important step that we need to highlight for countries who want to reform their compulsory licensing mechanism, but also to look at voluntary licenses and see if they are specifically excluded, to act in them and to issue compulsory licenses. Lastly, I would say this, that if we were to do what we did in hepatitis C, which was to work country by country, or HIV, work country by country for compulsory licenses, millions of people would die of COVID-19, simply waiting for these licenses or compulsory licenses to be put in place. So I think what is very clear, the TRIPS waiver sort of offers a solution to do what we have done in 10 years for hepatitis C and HIV. And I think this is very important. We don't have 10 years for COVID-19. So highlighting this very important step by Malaysia, nevertheless highlighting that we do need to do more about ensuring that we don't take 10 years to ensure access, and maybe the waiver is a perfect solution to not going country by country, but actually applying it in an efficient manner. Lastly, I would say is this, that states and governments have completely failed to regulate VL practices, which is extremely unfortunate. And within that, I would like to highlight a particular area which is really problematic. One is, of course, the medicines patent pools, voluntary licenses that leave out people in key manufacturing countries. So, China and India, which have one of the biggest populations in the world, are now starting to, China, of course, was constantly excluded from, generics who entered into a license with MPP were excluded from supplying patients in their own country. Now that trend is very clear that India is falling into that same very trap. And what we see is in the recent hepatitis C licenses for 2 new hepatitis C drugs, India can export, Indian generic companies can export, but they cannot supply domestically. So that's a disturbing trend that needs to be addressed. Secondly, I would like to highlight the whole debate on technology transfer. We've had some experiences with technology transfer terms and conditions within licenses. More recently with Delaminid, the TB drug. Now, of course, there was a lot of excitement when the new TB drugs came, bedaquiline and Delaminid. The survival rate for XDR was 18%, for MDR it was 50%. 1 out of 2 patients was not being cured or lost their lives. And this was something that was unacceptable. So when bedaquiline and Delaminid came on the horizon of treatment providers, obviously there was an attempt to try and access those. Among them was MSF. And what we very quickly realized is that Otsuka was unwilling to license the drug to the MPP. Moreover, it was refusing to license to cover all high burden countries. Incidentally, Otsuka did not have a presence, commercial presence in those countries, and was not in a position to commercialize these drugs. And in India, we had to file a non-working letter. We had to point out to the government that they were enjoying a patent term, but they were not registering the medicine. And it took 4 years to get the medicine registered. What we realized subsequently that Otsuka did enter into an agreement with Mylan, which is a US pharmaceutical generic company, and then decided to restrict Mylan's ability to produce its own API. And therefore, Mylan could never supply MSF with an affordable version of Delaminid. Now, these conditions on technology transfer only expire very near the patent term expiry. So therefore, Otsuka quite smartly decided to lift these conditions towards the end of the patent term. And our experience of technology transfer agreements or agreements that contain technology transfer is that they are restrictive, they actually may undermine competition. And in the case of Brazil, in the case study that we documented, delayed fixed dose combinations, did not allow Brazilian public sector companies to export outside Brazil. And therefore, technology transfer agreements need to be analyzed quite seriously. And lastly, I would like to say is this, that there's a whole list of restrictive terms and conditions in our briefing documents. So if anyone has questions, we'll be happy to take them. But from a treatment provider's point of view, I would say that in the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that voluntary licenses will go so far. We've seen this in remdesivir, which is a drug which has been delisted by the WHO. But at the beginning of the pandemic, a license was issued to certain Indian companies and a couple of other companies from other jurisdictions, but very cleverly excluding middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and high-income countries. And therefore, Gilead continued to retain control of majority of the market. Lastly, even if you look at the AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute agreement, which has caused a lot of excitement and has been welcomed by a lot of stakeholders, it restricts the Serum Institute's ability to go beyond LMICs. And therefore, we need to not only access the agreement between Serum Institute and AstraZeneca, we need to also scrutinize what technology transfer terms and conditions have been put in. And lastly, I think the exclusion of half the world within the SRI territory list is just not acceptable in a pandemic. So I'm going to hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Lina. We'll move now to Burcu Kilik. Burcu, you have the floor now.
Okay, thank you. I have a presentation. Let me, okay. If you stop, Lina, sharing your presentation.
I'm trying to do that. Just a second. I am so sorry for being.
Okay, I can start now. Like while we are waiting for you, I'll pick up where Lina left, and I'll talk a little bit about what's happening with vaccines, and especially vaccines manufacturing contracts, because there are really interesting examples there. So let's see. Now my files is interesting. There we go. Okay, so thank you, Lina and Carlos, laying the groundwork for my presentation. So I'm going to share some real life examples for you related to vaccine manufacturing contracts. So far we know that there are a few vaccines which prove to be effective. One of them is BioNTech Pfizer vaccine. The other one is Moderna. Both of these vaccines are mRNA technology. This is a new technology. It's a new and complex technology. And these vaccines are quite new. And since the beginning of the pandemic, we know that these companies have been working on these vaccines, but in the meantime, they've been doing some contract manufacturing agreements. They've been signing these agreements. So as Lina mentioned, we don't have access to these agreements, but there are a few examples I really like to share with you. But before we look into the agreements, I like to highlight a few issues from vaccine manufacturing, because this is like one of the highlights of these discussions, and everyone has been saying that, there are voluntary licenses and contract manufacturing is happening, so you don't really need to worry. But the problem is like to successfully produce these vaccines like at a large scale, you really need to address the IP barriers for effective technology transfer. And patents are relevant, although many people have been claiming that patents are not relevant. They are relevant, and I'm going to demonstrate that. But also trade secret and confidential information are highly important for vaccine manufacturing. So for such a long time, we heard that for vaccines, IP is not a moot point, but actually it is. So we have done a patent landscaping for both BioNTech and Moderna's vaccine. And you can see that like both of the companies have like extensive they have built like an extensive patent portfolio over these vaccines, because both of the companies have been working on the mRNA platform for such a long time, and they just repurposed their technology for COVID-19. And these are the list of the patents and patent applications they have on these mRNA technologies. But something important that came out from that research, while we were doing the research, we checked in research about the patent portfolio, we checked all the patents and patent applications. We also have a look at the financial statements of these companies. In both, in financial statements of both of these companies highlighted the importance of like trade secrets and confidential information. When you look at the BioNTech's financial statements, it says that our ability to stop third parties from making, using, selling, offering to sell, or importing our products may depend on the extent which we have rights under valid and enforceable patents, trade secrets, or other intellectual property rights that cover these activities. And similarly, Moderna has been saying that or business and financial, and they identified that this as a risk, or business and financial results may be adversely affected due to the variety of factors associated with or expanding global business, which includes our inability to directly control commercial activities because we are relying on third parties. So, as I mentioned, these companies have been going around the world for a while, and they've been signing these agreements for contract manufacturing. But as they made it clear in their financial statements, IP is an important asset for those companies. So they are very, very particular about protecting their intellectual property, especially their trade secrets and manufacturing information. So unfortunately, we don't have access to most of those contracts that they signed with other companies all around the world. But only exception is Moderna has signed a manufacturing agreement with Lonza Pharma and Biotech, which is based in Switzerland. And this agreement is available, and it's a very interesting agreement. I strongly recommend everyone to have a look at it, just to get an insight into this kind of like manufacturing agreements. The terms and conditions are very, very restrictive. It's like the term of the contract is for 10 years, but the terms really restrict what Lonza can do with the technology that is transferred to Lonza to produce these vaccines. And it makes it clear, the agreement makes it clear that Moderna possesses an extensive intellectual property and expertise which related to mRNA, and Lonza has the manufacturing and process expertise. And Lonza has heightened obligations to protect and maintain the confidentiality and trade secret nature of the Moderna's manufacturing know-how. So the contract makes it clear that when it comes to vaccines, the manufacturing know-how is the most important issue, like the key issue. And contract also makes it clear that Lonza has very limited, very limited rights over that manufacturing information. As I said, the term of the contract is for 10 years, but at the end of the contract, Lonza makes a commitment not to use that technology, which is transferred to Lonza for production of these vaccines. So this is the only agreement which is available to public. As I mentioned, like there is contract manufacturing happening, there is technology transfer happening for a while since the beginning of the pandemic. Unfortunately, we don't know the terms and conditions of these agreements, and we have very limited access. So as Carlos addressed, there are power asymmetries, because one side possesses an extensive intellectual property, calls the shots, and the companies like Lonza, which is a Swiss company, Swiss biotech company, have so much have manufacturing capacity, but Lonza's rights and obligations are very well established, and it doesn't have much to gain from this agreement apart from manufacturing the vaccines for Moderna. We have another examples of so-called voluntary licenses, but they are more like the manufacturing agreements. And as Lina mentioned, AstraZeneca has been going around and signing these agreements, contract manufacturing or voluntary licenses agreements, like depends on how you define the agreements, with a few companies. And so with Fiocruz from Brazil, the contract has been made available. I think it's leaked, and then the Fiocruz put that online. And then you can see the terms and the conditions of that agreement. Let's start. I tried to screenshot some of the important provisions so that you can see what we are talking about in these agreements and why it's highly controversial, why it's not technology transfer as we understood. First of all, the term of this agreement is only 12 months. And during the term of this agreement, Fiocruz sells and distributes the supplies of this finished vaccine under the terms of conditions of this agreement in the territory. And the territory is very defined as Brazilian territory. And there are annexes. Those annexes are not available, so we can't really know the details of the technology transfer and other issues, but you can see that there is a free non-exclusive license or sub-license valid in the territory, only in the territory, and use and same. And there's a kind of a technology transfer, but we don't know the details of the technology transfer either because it's in one of the annexes. Also, like, you know, that's something interesting. Contracting parties, which is Fiocruz, the Brazilian parties of this agreement, they can use their own visual identity, but they need to use different brands and visual identities from the AstraZeneca. So as I mentioned, there are annexes, exhibits to this contract which are not available online, and they include details. And just a reminder, AstraZeneca hasn't invented this vaccine. It's an Oxford vaccine. It's invented by University of Oxford. Licenses to AstraZeneca. Now AstraZeneca has been doing the technology transfer. And these terms and conditions look better compared to the Moderna case, because in Moderna it is very restrictive, but still this is not the solution, because like the contract makes it very, very clear that like this is a limited term contract, and it doesn't necessarily provides answer to what's going to happen after 12 years. The parties can extend the contract, yes, but what happens to that technology? Will Fiocruz continue to produce these vaccines or pay royalties to AstraZeneca? That's not very clear. So as I mentioned, like these companies, they call the shots. And these kind of contracts are very restrictive in terms of territory, in terms of how parties can use the technology, whether they can build on that intellectual property that is transferred to them. So since the terms are restrictive, what parties can do. So we can't really necessarily talk about like, you know, technology transfer from the side from the pharmaceutical companies, because they are using most of this, like in the case of Fiocruz, this sounds more like a contract manufacturing agreement. It's not bad as the Moderna's one, but still, because of the restrictive terms, it's very hard to talk about like meaningful technology transfer, which will make like which will change the vaccine production like environment in Brazil. So the contracts raise lots of like questions. And there are also other kinds of contracts that these companies have been signing with the governments. Like, I mean, you have Operation Warp Speed contracts that these companies signed with the US government. There are also I mean, we have the copies of these contracts, but I'm not showing it to you because most of them are redacted. So when it comes to the terms and conditions, everything is redacted. And that's why, like, you know, it's really hard for us as public interest groups or the consumer advocacy groups, what's in these contracts, and saying that voluntary licenses are there for meaningful technology transfer. It doesn't necessarily make sense. Just look at the contracts and see what's in the contracts. It's not the technology transfer. So we need alternative solutions. What is the alternative solutions? As I demonstrated in these companies, like financial statements, the IP is a very important for these companies and for these technologies. And when we talk about these technologies, we don't necessarily talk about, like, you know, simple technologies. These are complex technologies. We talk about artificial intelligence. Like, most of the manufacturing has been manufacturing system utilizes artificial intelligence, and there are also, like, you know, copyright related issues when it comes to algorithms and artificial intelligence. That's why, like, you know, we need a broader solutions. We need a solution to do the paperwork, like a solution to do the, you know, to say that to countries, okay, the IP barriers, we just put a hold on that. Let's focus on how we can manufacture these vaccines. And this is the only example for vaccines. You may say that, like, vaccines are complex technologies, developing countries, and they don't necessarily have capacity to produce these vaccines. I've been talking to some of the manufacturers in those countries, and they told me that there is no reason for them not to produce mRNA vaccines if there are no IP barriers, and if there is, like, if there are incentives from the governments. So, you know, we may have the solution at hand. We just need to push hard for that, because this shows us that, like, voluntary licenses or contract manufacturing agreements are not the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Burcu. I give the floor now to Dr. Hu Young-kyung, who is the Policy Coordinator and Senior Legal Advisor with the MSF Access Campaign. Yuan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I will also share my screen very quickly and to continue the discussion. So now when we have reviewed the issues with voluntary license and how the practice in a pandemic have also kind of give us additional warning how we should not rely on companies' voluntary willingness to deliver a pandemic. So I will quickly go through the TRIPS waiver discussion and then to see what kind of claims have been made by countries who are disagree with the TRIPS proposal, TRIPS waiver proposal, and what kind of a reality. So very quick recap, as Professor Correa and other colleagues has mentioned, what happened now at the WTO is not something out of blue. If we look at the IP issues around COVID-related technologies since the beginning of the pandemic, we have seen from MSF perspective, industry at large continue the business as usual approach. So we see companies continue using very restricted and limited voluntary license. Although our organization MSF together and although alongside with many other organizations have been calling for really open sharing and make a worldwide availability and accessibility of COVID-related technologies, all of this mechanism has not really been taken by the pharmaceutical industry. And early in July, South Africa submitted a communication to the WTO TRIPS Council, outlined the need to have a comprehensive looking at the IP issue. And in early July, African Union also issues a communique calling for urgent action to address IP barriers, especially related to vaccine. And then industry associations, as we know, IFPMA openly rejected the WHO's proposal to have a global technology pool for COVID-19 technologies. And so far, as we know, the proposal of the TRIPS waiver have been initially discussed by the members at the TRIPS Council in WTO. And this Thursday, a formal session will be organized at TRIPS Council, continue the discussion, and then members would agree on a report to be submitted to the General Council about this process. And from the public information, we also know, although many developing countries consider this is a very timely and critical discussion in order to provide additional policy spaces to help members and countries to prepare and in responding to extraordinary situation in COVID. The proposal has not been supported by some WTO members, including the US, UK, Canada, Australia, Norway, Brazil, and EU. So in terms of what has been proposed, and I think I assume everybody already very familiar with the proposal, is related to the possibility for members to choose not to implement, apply, or enforce certain obligations related to patent and disclosed information, copyrights, and industry design on COVID-19 related technology until the majority of the world population receive vaccine and develop immunity. So I just quickly go through some of the opposing opinions we heard so far and what we see from MSF perspective, how those myths and claims are not really true. I mean, many issues that have been outlined and discussed by Lina and other colleagues, I will be brief. For instance, voluntary license have been one reason some of the opponents thinks, you know, we should encourage the company to do more. However, as we say, what is open licensing, worldwide coverage is welcome. We have seen very limited action so far. So there's a lot of claim and say IP is not a barrier for now, but then we have plenty of evidence from the past and emerging evidence now, as Burcu outlined, showing IP would be a barrier very soon. And then there's a claim of IP is the reason enabled the R&D outcome in COVID-19. But then we also know it is actually public funding from all different type of government. It's unprecedented speed and scale and amount of public funding by all governments and the global collective effort by scientific community, including general public and everybody, actually enabled the R&D outcome in COVID-19. And there's a claim of TRIPS flexibility are sufficient. As Professor Correa mentioned, flexibility are super important. We encourage every country to make it into full. However, in the pandemic, it could be limited because there are territorial limitation and the requirement to issue compulsory license, for instance, on the product by product basis, which may not really fit the purpose. And there's also a claim and saying that in order to achieve global equitable access, we should just rely on COVAX facility, which is a vaccine pillar, and the WHO access to COVID technology tools accelerator. However, ironically, while those global initiatives are very important, and actually MSF has been very actively in engaging all of the product pillar and the ACTA, they are very important. However, as we also know, not only the COVAX and the ACTA are facing a funding gap, but wealthier countries who who kind of striked bilateral deals and booked a large portion of the supply capacity globally, especially for vaccine, are actually competing and undermining those global initiatives. Ironically, many countries who already secured their access are among those who are against the waiver proposal. So there's also other claim and saying, even if IP is removed, there's no way, developing country cannot actually produce COVID-19 technologies, especially vaccine, they cannot produce. And there's also commentary saying not only they cannot produce, they cannot even manage deliverable, so they can't do anything, developing countries. But I mean, of course, we know those kind of claims are not really new. It has been used in the past, and evidence has shown those presumptions are proven to be wrong. And developing countries have capacity to produce many things. And we also see some of the perceived very complex technologies, for instance, recombinant vaccines, conjugate vaccines, have been produced independently by developing country manufacturers. And India, for instance, remains as a pharmacy for developing country who continue to produce quality assured generic medicine and other technologies. And many developers in developing countries are actually working on more advanced version of COVID vaccine that would actually suit for developing countries' perspective, such as, for instance, many news are reporting mRNA vaccine developed by Pfizer and Moderna, but we also know those, especially Pfizer's vaccine, required -70 degree temperature for storage, which would cause logistic and storage difficulty for resource-limited settings. And we know scientists in developing countries, including India, China, and others, are looking into thermal stability version of mRNA vaccine. So the claim that the developing countries have no capacity to do whatsoever is completely wrong. And another new claim we just heard is IP holders are the best to produce safety and quality product in COVID, which we also, has plenty of literature and discussion proven this kind of linkage between IP and quality are not normatively correct, and also factually developing countries are producing quality assured and safe products for a very long time. So I will just quickly maybe go through some example of patents that some colleagues have mentioned. In terms of therapeutics and vaccines, so I would not repeat what have been said, but there's one example we would like to a few more examples we would like to call for your attention. One is the emerging pipeline of therapeutics, especially for monoclonal antibody therapeutics. Some of the candidates, for instance, these two candidates listed here, which are also included in a recent MSF briefing. I put a link here. You can look at, and the patent has been widely filed and granted in more than 50 developing countries, and we haven't seen any concrete access strategy from the company to see how to address it if the clinical trial data show efficacy. For vaccine, Berthold has mentioned a lot of examples and problems with the licensing and agreement so far on COVID-19 vaccine. I will just share one past experience with MSF when we were following the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine 30-valent, a product that has been monopolized by Pfizer for decades and longer, and preventing more affordable version to be available for children. And we have been following that pipeline independently developed in South Korea, India, China, or alternative version, and witnessed how the restrictive IP strategy by Pfizer actually forced the South Korea company to close their development line when the company nearly finished their phase 3 clinical trial and was about to launch the first alternative version of PCV13. And then that particular patent that Pfizer was enforcing in South Korea and in India has been challenged and rejected in other countries. So it shows that the very excessive and broad scope of patenting could concretely limit the availability of vaccines globally. And we have a report here, I also put a link, showing that it is a common practice in the vaccine industry to apply widely and broadly different kinds of patents from the beginning to the very end of how vaccine was used. So whereas the pipeline of COVID-19 vaccine are coming into the reality, how companies are managing an IP and how government should take action preventing any restrictive practice hindering global access becomes ever very, very urgent. For instance, I mean, in addition to production process, patent has been resorted to the schedule of vaccines. So now we talk about 2 doses for COVID-19. In the past, for other vaccine, 2 doses as a method and schedule has been applied for patent and granted in some country. So we cannot afford this kind of practice to happen in the pandemic when everybody in the world are needing an effective vaccine to help safely work out of the pandemic. So I will probably stop here, and there's a slide with more, illustration how we see the myths claimed by EU and US and others are proven wrong. And I put some link here for MSF publication. So welcome colleagues to have a look, and we look forward to continue the discussion. So let's stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuan. Now we come to our last, but of course not least, presenter, Mustaqim Degama, who is counselor at the South African mission to the WTO and the United Nations, and also a co-sponsor of the TRIPS waiver proposal we've already heard mentioned too. So Mustaqim, to you, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Viviana. It's very good to be in the company of so many experts. I just wanted to say that the proposal has really generated a lot of debate. And I think a lot of the points that would have been raised by other panel members fully take this up. But I wanted first to indicate that many of the delegations that oppose the waiver proposal bring up the question of voluntary licenses. Now, I want to speak about this maybe from a different perspective. As a contract lawyer, I see all types of licensing agreements as voluntary, in the sense that companies will construct these licenses based on the monopoly rights that they have. And so the very heart of every license that you find is a commercial basis. So a company will look at the commercial strength of the business case and license in that particular light. And so from a public health perspective, looking only at these types of licenses, or if you want to call them voluntary licenses, these do not achieve public interest objectives because firstly, they have a commercial overhang. The second point I think that has certainly come out in the discussion is really that the license is designed to exclude. And certainly we've seen this in many of the licenses that would have been concluded between some of the vaccine producers and the licensees, very much cutting up territories. But what is also very important, and I think this has also been underlined, is the fact that we are not fully cognizant of what these terms are. Whether or not the licensees are allowed to produce for the territories in which they are situated, if these are exclusively for other territories, is it exclusively at the discretion of the licensor? So from that perspective, these types of arrangements are exclusively commercial, exploitative, and they usually impose limits to extract the most profit from the jurisdictions where they operate. And so from this perspective, it's not entirely surprising that even your voluntary international mechanisms are designed only to cover your low and middle income countries, whereas some developing countries that are classified as middle and higher income developing countries are excluded. And this has a very unfair impact because the exclusion criteria are based on sole indicators such as GDP per capita or GNI per capita. And these certainly are not factors that fully explain the situation of countries. And so from that perspective, I think that the licenses as such, are commercial instruments that do not address the public interest issues that we as co-sponsors have put on the table. A second point that has eloquently been made is the intersection beyond patents. So when we discuss access to medicines and medical technology and so forth, we always think about patents. Once again, I think Johan very rightly pointed out, South Africa had placed an item on the agenda of the July TRIPS Council, where we had wanted to have a discussion about flexibilities beyond patents themselves. How does it apply in the copyright space? How does it apply in undisclosed confidential information? How does it apply in many of the other areas? And certainly the policy uncertainty that continues to apply here may have an impact on the ability of governments to address pandemics of this particular nature. And so from that point of view, in the policy uncertainty that we see, it's very difficult to envisage either a voluntary or a compulsory license being issued in respect of, let's say, trade secrets. Whereas it's a well-known practice for access to drugs or biologicals or something of that nature, it's not really something that we've seen in the space for trade secrets and the like. And I think, as Professor Correa also indicated, there has also been a shift from patenting exclusively medicines, biologicals, and all of that, and shifting some of the protected IP interest to trade secrets. And so from that point of view, it makes it much more difficult, even if you have access to, or even if you waive a patent, there may be some business confidential information that is protected via a different mechanism. And this is why the co-proponents wanted to formulate the waiver in such a way that you are able to access all of the areas that are necessary to address COVID-19. I think also in terms of transparency, it's been underlined that we don't have all the information. Many of the producers now have announced some sort of licensing agreements and given price undertakings. But what we also see is that these are once again cast in contractual language that says this price undertaking will last only for as long as COVID-19 is prevalent. So if COVID-19 is addressed in the originator's country of origin in March or April, that means the price could quadruple. So the carry forward in terms of what we see is that if we allow these unilateral voluntary licenses to be executed, they may not achieve the public interest, and certainly they will not achieve the types of volumes that we need to address COVID-19. So from a transparency perspective, we don't have all the information. And so there, I think it's going to be important to pay attention. And I think the waiver proposal really looks at that aspect as well. In conclusion, I also wanted to say that there are two things that's very, very important. The first is that many of our countries do not have examining a system. So we don't have substantive examination, which means that even if you have a repurposed drug, you automatically give a patent for that particular patent application. Whereas if you had an examination system, one could essentially reject the particular application. And if there were to be, or if there was a voluntary licensing agreement in place, that voluntary licensing agreement would automatically be terminated or would be unbundled depending on the legal effect of such a ruling. So it is important to continually increase the capacity of the IP system to guard against these particular aspects. The last point I wanted to make is that many of the delegations that oppose the waiver proposal say that the technology is too complex and so forth, but this is not what we've seen. Even the current agreements allow developing countries that already have capacity to produce safely, and this is the other point. Many of the opposition indicate that safety and efficacy may be an issue when it comes to developing countries, but it's these very developing countries that are producing for developed markets, and there's never an issue of safety and efficacy there. So at the end of the day, I think the issue is not capacity on the side of developing countries. I think the issue is incentive. Our manufacturers are not sufficiently incentivized. If you look at the one example in terms of Article 31 bis, we will see that if you have a licensing agreement or a waiver that applies for too short a time, you don't give the incentive to producers to actually invest and actually produce in order to recoup that investment. And so from that perspective, to make a long story short, I don't think that as many of the developed countries are alleging, there is an issue of capacity. I don't think it's an issue of capacity. If a producer has to go through too many loops in able to produce, it certainly does chill the ability of such a producer to really enter the market or to produce beyond its national territory. And so from that perspective, if we carry this particular proposal, it opens up the market for more producers to come in a shorter period of time. As Bourdieu said in one meeting, it does the paperwork so that the work can be done on the ground. And what we see is that even if we have authorizations for vaccines, it will take a very long time for the production to actually go up. And so from that perspective, it is in our best interest to have more producers within a shorter period of time in order that we are able to ramp up our production capacity. Viviana, I leave it at that, but certainly would thank the South Center and MSF for putting up this very useful webinar.
Thank you, Mustaqim, and thank you to all the panelists for the excellent presentations. We have a few minutes left, so we'll just take very quickly some of what were the questions that have been posed in the Q&A, and then we'll come back to the panelists for each one to close with the key points. So one of the questions that has been addressed is with regards to the hope of the declaration that the COVID-19 vaccine would be a public good that could be available to everyone equitably. And the question is, is this still possible given that the pharmaceutical companies have benefited from support by public funding from different governments? So in this relation, we have seen that there is a different innovation ecosystem, but many of the panelists mentioned we have business as usual in terms of licenses and contracts. Would anyone care to make a mention on this issue? Are we getting closer to a COVID-19 vaccine as a public good, and then what can be done? Clearly, we heard from the panelists the mention that the voluntary approach is insufficient and the waiver could open another avenue. Would anyone like to mention anything on this issue, in particular the public financing? How should this play a different role? Bourdieu, would you like to make a note on that?
Yeah, because I mean, we have done extensive research on the public funding issue and the public funding of the vaccines, particularly the Moderna vaccine. But it looks like we are talking to a wall. Since the March, we've been raising these issues, and like in policy circles, they have people have been receptive to this idea, but the practice shows us that the things work differently in reality. So yes, in an ideal world, COVID-19 vaccine should be a public good, but we don't live in that ideal world. And as we've seen in last few months, like all the developed countries which funded the research and development of these vaccines, not only the Moderna, like German government have invested in BioNTech initial research and development in that company, but they've been rushing to sign agreements with these companies. So maybe in a couple of years we will be talking about like COVID-19 vaccine being a public good after everyone in developed countries vaccinated. But in terms of like not only equitable access, but timely and equitable access, it sounds like, I mean, it sounds good on paper, but that's not the reality in practice.
Thanks, Burcu. We have another question directed to Mustaqim, and perhaps Mustaqim, with this, I'll give you your last word on the webinar before passing to the others. So the question is that, assuming we can have the waiver, how quick can domestic action follow, and what can, for example, civil society organizations do to assist governments in the South in that process?
Yes, thank you, Viviana. That's a very good question. I think it will take a couple of months just to set the infrastructure in place, but that's where civil society organizations come in. They have the experience in terms of managing projects of this nature. I would think that the first port of call would be to ensure that those countries that have production capacity get the production up. We also need to ensure that national systems have mechanisms in place to firstly be able to get vaccines in, which means the regulatory framework would need to be in place, the regulatory approvals would have to be there. And I think that can be done very quickly based on some common approaches that could be suggested. I also think, Viviana, that from operationalization of the waiver, many of us find ourselves in different situations. So some of us don't have any manufacturing capacity. And so, getting access in the quickest way would require one set of regulatory approaches. In other senses, we do have countries that may have either production capacity, but there would be other requirements that would have to be operationalized. But I think from a regional perspective, regional organizations are best situated to try and see how these particular scenarios can play out. We know Article 31(3)(c) provides for a regional exception, but only if 50% of your members are LDCs. Now, if one were to waive those requirements, any regional organization may play a pivotal role to ensure that the delivery, the infrastructure and capacity of national jurisdictions are augmented. So different strokes for different folks, but at the end of the day, I think it would require some intensive preparation for implementation, but this is not impossible. This is where civil society organizations may be able to play a role.
Thank you, Mustaqim. Lena, would you like to give us some last words?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that there's a very important role that freedom to information and right to information laws need to play in the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically with respect to these contractual arrangements, which include licenses and, of course, agreements between companies, agreements between government and companies and so on, and labs, public research labs, and, of course, private entities. So that's my first point. And the second point I just sort of wanted to make was this, that when it comes to R&D, I think people find it difficult to grasp why we are asking for collective management. But in India, when the government gives you land for a school, and then the school mismanages admission policies or overcharges for fees, the government and the courts step in to protect public interest, because the land on which the school is built comes from the public. And I think this is exactly what we are trying to say on R&D, that the land on which R&D or the commercialization of products is being made is basically on public interest money that has been poured into the research of COVID-19 medical products. Lastly, I think if the waiver comes through, we will see a speeding up of agreements that allow generic capacity to be scaled up. For the simple reason, we've seen that you do need pressure to move things along. And I think the waiver does that wonderfully, not only just on companies, but our patent offices, who have been extremely lax in granting hundreds of patents in the past, if not thousands, on very poor quality patents on medical products. So I think the waiver solves two problems at the same time. the failure of the voluntary mechanism, and the weaknesses in our patent offices. And lastly, I agree with Professor Correa that TRIPS flexibilities are extremely important. And finally, it's nice to see the EU acknowledge them. However, it does require considerable preparation country by country. So why not do it all together under the waiver? Thanks.
Viviana, you are on mute.
Thank you. I'll pass now to Burcu. And just to note also, Burcu, if you could try to address the question that was also posed with regards to how can we improve transparency in terms of more of the contracts and the licensing terms. There has been, in the case of Brazil, as was mentioned, there was the use of some of the Brazilian legislation on transparency because it involved a public agency. With the experience of public citizen in this area, what more could be done on transparency?
Yeah, thank you. And we've been filing FOIA requests since the beginning of the pandemic, especially the contracts related to Operation Warp Speed. And we've received some of the contracts, as I mentioned, but they are heavily redacted. So that's not a good practice. And when and I shared the contract that Moderna published with Lonza, that's a good practice for companies to publish their manufacturing contracts. And I believe one of the reasons Moderna published that contract was there was a public pressure on Moderna to publish like the agreements it signed. So I think we should continue doing what we've been doing, pressuring companies to publish these contracts they've been signing with other companies, but with also governments, because for instance, we don't know the terms and conditions of most of the contracts like that companies sign with the governments to sell the vaccines, to provide vaccines to those governments. So like, I know that in some countries, and I know that our European allies have been trying really hard to get access to those contracts. We need to push until we get the transparency we need, because transparency is key for accountability, and we need to hold our governments and these companies accountable for these contracts, because at the end of the day, there is a public interest in this issue, and there is a huge public interest, enormous public interest. This is a public health emergency, and many people's lives depends on those contracts. So we really need to push our governments and also companies to be more transparent. Currently, the system is not transparent at all.
Thanks, Burcu. Now, Yuan, to you for closing, and also to note there was a question about how the waiver would affect also trade secrets that are available now. If you could also address that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I will try. Trade secrets is definitely a new area and kind of emerging issue, as we panelist has mentioned. The waiver is trying to look beyond the patents. I mean, so far, many countries are very familiar with TRIPS flexibility to address patent barrier, but less about non-patent exclusivities. So we have some example of protection of testing data. Some countries do have quite stringent law protecting kind of testing data. Although it is not really a TRIPS obligation, it's a TRIPS plus provision in many national laws. But if they would argue, some countries argue they have that law because of TRIPS, but it's not really true. And industry have been trying to claim, for instance, test data as trade secret. We have seen European Court of Justice cases in the past when company was trying to sue European Medicines Agency out of using trade secret as a claim for testing data. So this is actually the opportunity now. to have a country to really looking into that, specify what kind of information should never be claimed, should not be claimed as trade secret to start with, in order to have the sufficient defense when company claim trade secret out of a pandemic. Of course, different countries have a quite different situation when it comes to trade secret protection. Some of them have quite diversified national law, but by implementing the TRIPS waiver, whether trade secret is kind of directly derived from a certain provision of TRIPS, would country can have a looking at their national law, whether by suspending some of the enforcement of trade secret law could potentially help information specifically under the licensing agreement to be required to be public information. But this, I think this process also opened the opportunity for countries to consider future law, because many countries acknowledge actually flexibility on trade secret probably less than patent. Whether using the pandemic as the opportunity, we should also discuss the future more kind of longer term legislative mechanism to make sure public interests are sufficiently protected. So I think last point I want to make is related to public good and what we can learn from the Doha Declaration in HIV/AIDS. When some colleague mentioned there's some analogy to be made. But one thing we could potentially we should keep in mind is that when Doha Declaration was passed as a landmark decision by WTO, it was already a bit late. It was a few years into the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Many people died, and the monopoly are blocking access to life-saving medicine for millions of people globally. So we should not make that tragedy to happen again, because now it's early in the pandemic, and it's actually for government to take action to learn from the past. And then global public good debate, as the person said, we have been talking to the wall, but I still think there's a potential there. But I think because civil society organizations' demands are very clear. It's not only about, we rich country give money to COVAX and distribute. This is not public good we're talking about. We're talking about a lasting, equitable and ecosystem that the technologies developed in the pandemic could stay with the public. We're talking about open science, and we're talking open sharing and more sustainable ways, so that after the pandemic, more country could, timely access, timely access. So that's are still very important normative objective for a country to bear in mind, and we think the waiver proposal really provide a very unique opportunity to pursue.
Thank you, Jan. Professor Carlos Correa for the closing.
Well, thank you, Viviana, and thank you for the speaker for very informative presentations. Let me just make a couple of technical comments on the issues you were just discussing, for instance, about the trade secrets. Interestingly, in the United States, there have been several decisions by the Federal Trade Commission obliging companies under antitrust law to transfer trade secrets to competitors. The latest decision by the FTC, Federal Commission, was in the case Mallinckrodt, which involved actually a medicinal product, a hormone, for some diseases of the children. This was in 2017. So there are precedents. Trade secret protection cannot be more absolute than protection of patents. Interestingly, also the Department of Finance of Switzerland commissioned a study on technical information, which was published in 2018. In this study, the expert group established by the Department of Finance of Switzerland recommended actually compulsory license for technical information. So this should not be a surprise for developed countries that this may happen in this field. Another brief comment about the capacity in developing countries to produce drugs. When this crisis started, as you may know, the European Union, for instance, learned that for some products, 80 or 90% of pharmaceutical products were coming from India and China. And this is why Chancellor Merkel and other European leaders started to say that Europe had to regain sovereignty, autonomy in the production of pharmaceuticals. The same is, and Burku knows this better than myself, in the case of the United States, a large part of the generic pharmaceuticals sold in the United States come from developing countries. So there is no question that developing countries are able to produce with a right quality. I fully agree that in the case of vaccines, know-how is particularly important as compared to chemical products in general, but this is not impossible for many manufacturers in developing countries. But just to end in relation to the waiver itself, let me add that to what Mostakim has mentioned, that waiver is a very well recognized institution within the GATT WTO system. So this is not something exceptional that never happened. In the area of intellectual property, of course, we had a waiver that led to the adoption of Article 31 bis, but in other areas, waiver is common, it's subject to monitoring, it's subject to review. So there is nothing that will undermine the basis of the WTO system. It is part of the WTO system. And this measure must be used in order to respond to a crisis like this. I think today is the time for the WTO to show that it's a global entity which is responsible and able to get the public goods. So it's not just an entity which deals with commercial interests of traders. WTO must show to the international community that it can act as international organization, which has the flexibility to respond to an emergency like this. I think this is part of the credibility and the survival of the organization as a respectable organization. It must show that public health can come first as in relation to commercial interests. And then finally, governments are under pressure in this emergency. So governments will take all measures which are necessary. So if the opponents to the waiver continue to block it, in any case, governments will do what is necessary in order to provide medication and vaccines and provide equipment to the population. Interestingly, in the United States, you have also this asymmetry. In the United States, you have the so-called PrEP Act, which allows the government to consider immune of any action companies that violate state or federal laws, including in accordance to analysis, and even the webpage of the Department of Health of the United States show this, including the case of pharmaceuticals. So we have this asymmetry. Developing countries may not have this tool, and this is available in the United States and can be used in order to get immunization for any litigation of companies that in the crisis that we live in decide to not comply with state or federal law. Then we should be at the equal level, both developed and developing countries. The waiver is one means of doing this. There could also be use of the exemption that we know about, Article 73B in the TRIPS agreement. But certainly the waiver will provide a global solution, an agreed solution in the context of WTO, has several advantages that Master Kim has already indicated, including the fact that if the waiver is adopted, there is no obligation to use it. It will be up to each particular country to use as it needs. So this is not the undermining substantially IP protection. This is not abolishing intellectual property, which in fact, if you just allow me 1 minute still, Viviana, in the case of COVID, the conventional justification for intellectual property does not work. Intellectual property is justified on the basis of market failure. And here there is a huge market to be supplied. There have been billions of subsidies given to the company. So there is no justification whatsoever for the intellectual property to be enforced as it were in usual business in the context of COVID-19. Well, thank you very much again to all speakers and Viviana, to you for your moderation.
Thank you, Professor Correa. Thank you all panelists and all attendees for following us in this webinar. On behalf of MSF and South Center, we thank you very much. This will be made available so that you can follow on your own time. So have a good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Until next time. Have a great day.
Thank you.